Donald Trump says Daesh or ISIS has been obliterated. Despite its territorial losses in Syria and Iraq, has the group been 100% defeated, as the American president claims, or is the fight still far from over? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Ghida Fakhry. 5 years ago, a group calling itself the Islamic State, or Daesh, emerged across eastern Syria and northwestern Iraq. Its fighters captured city after city, including Mosul, Iraq's second largest, proclaiming a so-called caliphate on the 30th of June 2014. Now, at the height of its power, Daesh controlled more than 88,000 square kilometers between Syria and Iraq. That's an area that's larger than Belgium and the Netherlands combined. With more than 40,000 fighters from 100 countries, the group carried out attacks in Iraq, Syria, and 29 other countries. It generated billions of dollars to finance its operations, most of it coming from oil, taxation, robbery, and kidnapping. In a few moments, I'll be speaking with Congressman Scott Perry, who sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, about President Trump's repeated claims that the group has been defeated. But first we begin in Iraq, where millions of people lived under Daesh's oppressive rule. So what was life like for them? We went to Mosul to hear from some of the locals.
داعش ما خلى شيء ما نفذوا وعملوا والتجارب بهاي المدينة. يعني كان أبسط شيء إنه إذا واحد اللحية كانت قصيرة أو ما مطول اللحية أو ما مثل ما يمكن يقولون مطلق اللحية، كان يجلدوا ويعاقبوا. كموسيقي إنه ما أطيق أطلع ولا أطيق أحكي إنه أنا أطيق أعزف أو أنا أطيق أقول أنا موسيقي، هاي أبسط شيء. كان عقوبة الموسيقى إذا يعرفون إنه أنا موسيقي هي القتل، يعني بدون أي مبرر. جيت فترة انسجنت بوقت داعش لمدة شهر، جو اعتقلوني من البيت. طبعا انا قبل كنت التقيت بموسيقي اللي هو اسمه خالد صديقي، وعزفنا. فبعد هاي الفتره انه يعني كتبليغ ما اعرف الفكره شلون جت، انه جو على البيت تم اعتقالي. كان عندي كمانين، فقبل ما يعتقلوني فاتوا عملوا تفتيش للبيت. انا صرت اذكى منهم ودفنتوا الكمان بالحديقه، كمانين دفنتوهم بالحديقه. فما طقت اطلع الكمانات بعد ما طلعتوا من السجن، لان بقيتوا بالبيت ما طلعتوا اصلا خارج الباب بسبب الخوف منهم لا يرجعون يعتقلون، لان اذا صار اعتقالي مرتق فانا راح اموت يعني 100%، ماكو سبب. فبقيتوا بالبيت وما طلعتوا الكمانات الى ان جو الجيش ثاني يوم بعد ما تحررت المنطقه. ثاني يوم طلعتوا الكمان من الحديقه. طبعا هو كابوس، والكابوس مستحيل ينسي، ما دام شيء سيء مستحيل ينسي. فكان داعش على المدينة كابوس.
كمرأة أو كنساء هون بالموصل، الحياة بظل وجود داعش كلها كانت عبارة عن خطر، عن تهديد مستمر. يعني أول شيء الزي اللي فرضوا التنظيم، يعني لازم خمار، لازم تغطية لكل الجسم. كانوا يحاسبون على أدق التفاصيل، يعني إذا ممكن أحد الكفوف إذا المرأة كانت نازعته ممكن تتعرض للضرب، إذا شوية لبسها ما كان يناسب التنظيم ممكن تتعرض للجلد. هاي عدا عن الإجراءات اللي كانوا كل فترة يطلقوها، أنه هم ممكن يزوجون البنات بالغصب. وصلوا مرحلة أنه حتى إذا المرأة اندق باب البيت وفتحته ممكن تتعرض لمساءلة، أو ممكن زوجها أو أخوها أو ولي أمرها يتعرض للاعتقال أو للجلد أو للغرامات. كان بشكل عام لازم تروح للطبيبات، لكن إذا مثلا اضطرت أو إذا بالمستشفى بالطوارئ تروح للطبيب لازم بس بالنظر وبالسمع، يعني بدون كشف، بدون أي شيء. يعني كان جدا ممنوع. فترة اللي صار بها سقوط الموصل كانت فترة امتحانات بالنسبة لنا كطلبة بالجامعة، أغلب الكليات تعطلت. فخلال هاي الثلاث سنوات أنا ما داومت وخسرت 3 سنوات من حياتي الدراسية. والله للحظة أيست أنه ممكن تتحرر الموصل أو أنه ممكن نرجع يعني للحياة مرتلخ. وصلنا مرحلة يعني يأس شبه تام. يعني كمية الكبت اللي كانت موجودة مجرد ما صار التحرير انطلقت الناس كله، يعني أنا أو غيري كأنه شخص مسجون وتحرر.
Certainly a sense of cautious relief in Mosul. So how then do lawmakers here in Washington see the current status of Daesh? I sat down with US Republican Congressman Scott Perry earlier and asked him if he agreed with President Trump that the group has been 100% defeated.
Well, certainly if you look at it in terms of the caliphate and the territory required for a caliphate, I would agree with that. But I think that anyone's assessment would agree that there are a certain number of fighters, ISIS fighters, that are roaming around somewhere, maybe not even in the region, that have escaped and fled and that are out there. But the organizational structure, the caliph and the orders and the organized attacks, I think he's certainly correct about that, but I think we'd be foolish to believe that there aren't sympathizers and actors that were involved in hostile actions, activity that aren't still out there somewhere.
But when he's declared victory on ISIS,
right,
and he's done so no fewer than 17 times in the past 6 months alone, he wasn't just talking about the caliphate. On Twitter in December 2018, he said, "We have won against ISIS." Hours later, the Pentagon had to issue a statement to say the campaign still goes on, quote, "at this time." And then in February 2019, he announced again that ISIS is 100% defeated. The Pentagon did not confirm his remarks. So clearly there seems to be a disconnect between the military advisors and the president. Who do you think, Congressman, has got it right, the president or the generals?
Both of them. And this is why, as a person who works in political office as well as has been privileged to wear the military uniform of our country, in the military, we have very specific definitions of what defeat means, of different gradations of conflict and what they mean, and we work on that very specific level. As a policymaker, you don't work with those definitions. You work in a more abstract area.
But were his statements accurate? Were they premature? Because it does sound like an oversell to the American people, doesn't it? When you consider what several U.S. senior military officials have said. Take U.S. Army General Joseph Votel, who said this a couple of months ago. He said ISIS still has the leaders, still has the fighters, still has the resources.
I think in the political context, ISIS has been defeated, but they're going to have sympathizers that are still out there that are maybe going to use the banner of ISIS, and even people will claim ISIS, this is ISIS-inspired attack or event. And some of that have occurred since the president has said this.
But this doesn't sound like a resounding defeat. And again, you're saying that ISIS has been defeated. You're not specifying the caliphate. You said this in 2016. How can you defeat the enemy if you cannot identify the enemy? As you say, ISIS may have lost territory, and that is significant, but it is also stretched far beyond Iraq and Syria, to Sri Lanka, to Niger, to Afghanistan, the Philippines, and so many other countries. So let me ask you the same question today. How can you defeat the enemy if you cannot identify the enemy, which, as you say, has taken on a new version, a more amorphous, underground version? How do you defeat this enemy?
You can't defeat the enemy if you can't recognize it, but this enemy continually changes its name, continually changes its location, continually changes its tactics, techniques, and procedures, and so on and so forth. And so the overarching theme of this enemy is not necessarily ISIS. It's not necessarily not ISIS. It could be, like I said, Khorasan Group. It could be Boko Haram.
But there's a contradiction. What will victory then look like? You have said, and the president has said, we have been victorious against ISIS. What does victory look like? How do you know that you've defeated the group?
Victory looks like that, to me, it looks like that the Islamist extremists wishing to impose their theocratic doctrine on the world at large, or regionally, or even in certain states or location, has stripped of their ability to do that. That's what victory really looks like. But that's going to happen in parts, in geographic parts, and in organizational parts. So we might be victorious over Boko Haram at some point, but we are not yet.
So we're talking about ISIS, though. You said when President Obama, said a couple of years ago that he thinks ISIS can be contained, You criticized him for that. You said ISIS should be eradicated.
It should be eradicated.
Can it be eradicated militarily, and how do you destroy its ideology?
Destroying the ideology is a longer-term prospect, but destroying its ability to, and this goes to military definitions as well, destroying its ability to conduct operations successfully, generally speaking, from a military sense. If the enemy is incapable of conducting operations, that is seen as defeat of the enemy.
But it certainly hasn't been. I can just give you a list of attacks just the last few days, in fact. There was one on June 22nd, one on June 21st, Egypt, Iraq, June 20th, Afghanistan, June 19th, Syria, June 13th, Afghanistan, June 12th, Nigeria. The list goes on.
Sure.
There were 283 attacks, more than 1,200 people killed by ISIS so far in 2019.
So are those being ordered and instructed by al-Baghdadi and the leadership, or are those claims of affiliation to ISIS by individual actors or individual group actors in those locations? And I think there's a significant difference. And sure, like I said, there are going to be sympathizers, there were foreign fighters and indigenous fighters that joined the ISIS ideology and now have dispersed and are conducting attacks and attributing them to ISIS. But it is not the same as being directed from the hierarchy to do this in a coordinated way to achieve a certain end.
Well, it does sound like it's political expediency, though, when President Trump and many Republicans as well echo his view that ISIS has been defeated, when you yourself admit to the fact that there is a whole ideology out there, sympathizers, if not sleeper cells, and we know that there are plenty of those.
Sure.
Ambassador James Jeffrey, the Special Envoy for the State Department's Global Coalition to defeat ISIS, said this just a couple of months ago. He says ISIS still lives in various cells and in the minds of many of the people in the areas that we've liberated.
Right.
Is this just a temporary defeat at the very best?
It will be a temporary defeat if we don't stay vigilant ourselves and continue to work with our partners in those regions. And that was one of my frustrations with the previous administration, who said, we're done here, and just walked away completely.
But hold on, this is what President Trump did, because as soon as he declared ISIS defeated 100% in late February, he also said that he was actually walking away from Syria, pulling out 2,000 troops. His own Pentagon chief resigned,
that, right?
But he said he would. So my question to you is, was he right or wrong to suggest that the fight against ISIS was over and it was time to leave? How do you remain vigilant then?
He has left troops in the area because he was advised by his advisors that these folks are still out there, these individuals are still out there. And he is working in a paradigm as well where we have multiple threats. And so we have limited resources. And as much as we don't want to be the world's police, but we want a stable, secure world, and we have to rebalance our assets as appropriate. And I think that's what he did.
But does ISIS still pose a threat?
Absolutely. The ideology, whether it's ISIS, whether it's al-Qaeda or any of its affiliates, absolutely pose a threat and will continue to do so.
So let me ask you this about the ideology. There's the ideology and the funding. You previously said that the Saudis have been, quote, duplicitous and unreliable. You said this at a House hearing on the U.S.-Saudi counterterrorism relationship on the 24th of May 2016.
Right.
This was during President Obama's time in office.
Right.
You said that Saudi Arabia spends around $4 billion or more a year to spread Wahhabism around the globe. You asked this, you said, as an ally, is it too much to ask them to stop that? So today, would you ask the same of President Trump as you did of Obama?
Absolutely.
To put pressure on the Saudis?
Absolutely.
Have you?
Absolutely.
Do you believe that the United States has been, in some ways, complicit in all of this by allowing its close allies, Saudi Arabia, to fund the sort of ideology to spread Wahhabism while it looked the other way?
Complicit is an interesting term that I'm not sure I'd use, but I would say neglectful of Saudi Arabia's support of Wahhabism around the globe, funding, financing, supporting ideologically, but I also think that Saudi Arabia and the new leadership in Saudi Arabia has seen what has come from that, and is trying to make significant strides to change that. It takes time to move a big ship and change the greater opinion of a population that has been supportive of a certain policy over many, many decades, and it's not going to turn on a dime, but I do see movement in that regard that I think is positive, and so I'm willing to give some space in that regard and not be completely critical, but we have to understand and recognize where this thing started.
So does that mean you've changed your tune when it comes to the Saudis?
I'm in this case, President Reagan used to say trust but verify. I'd rather say verify and then trust. So the jury's still out, but I think they've made some statements and taken some actions that lead me to believe they're heading in the right direction. We'd like it to go faster, but it's easy for me to say. I'm not leading in Saudi Arabia, and I'm not living in Saudi Arabia. So I think it's difficult for them, and I understand that. But I'm willing to acknowledge that they seem to be changing their opinions a bit, and I think that's a good thing.
Despite the assertions made in Washington by the president and his Republican colleagues, the reality on the ground paints a different picture. Many of Daesh's top leaders are still alive, and it continues to carry out attacks across the world. Despite a drop in the number of successful attacks, the number of attempts has remained steady. According to the United Nations, there are still between 14,000 and 18,000 Daesh fighters in Iraq and Syria, many of them in sleeper cells. Thousands are said to have returned to their home countries across the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. So is the fight against Daesh really over, and what will the next phase of this battle be? Iraq's Brigadier General Yahya Rasool from Baghdad's Joint Command Operations gives us his take.
الآن المرحلة اللي نعمل عليها هو تكثيف الجهد الاستخباراتي والعمليات الاستخباراتية النوعية. الآن هناك بقايا لعصابة داعش الإرهابي، سواء من الفلول المنهزمة أو من بعض هذه الأفراد، وتحاول أن تنشئ خلايا إرهابية نائمة وأن تخطط للقيام بعمليات إرهابية. الآن لا يوجد قدرة لهؤلاء الإرهابيين وعصاباتهم أن يقومون بعمليات قتالية أو يسيطرون على مدن أو بقعة معينة من الأرض، لكن نركز على أن نمنع هؤلاء الإرهابيين أن يقوموا بأي عمليات، وفي نفس الوقت إلقاء القبض عليهم ونكثف العمل والجهد الاستخباراتي من خلال المصادر، من خلال الطائرات المسيرة، من خلال الكاميرات الحرارية، من خلال العمل النوعي الذي نقوم به. وحقيقة حققنا ضربات موجعة لبقايا هذه العصابات. وفق معلومات استخباراتية عراقية دقيقة، استطعنا خلال هذه الضربات والعمليات النوعية أن نقتل عدد من الإرهابيين، وأيضا تدمير أوكار والاستيلاء على معدات وأسلحة تركها هؤلاء الإرهابيين بعد العمليات التي تنفذ من قبل القطاعات العراقية. تم إلقاء القبض على 8 إرهابيين يعتبرون مهمين جدا، ومنهم والي الجنوب. كذلك هناك عدد من الإرهابيين يحملون الجنسية الأجنبية، وخص بالذكر منهم بحدود 14 يحملوا الجنسية الفرنسية. تم إلقاء القبض عليهم بعملية نوعية من قبل أبطال جهاز المخابرات الوطني العراقي بعد استدراجهم، وأيضا حولوا باتجاه القضاء العراقي. ما نعمل عليه هو أن لا نعطي فرصة لهؤلاء الإرهابيين أن نستمر بعملياتنا وأن نقضي عليهم، وفي نفس الوقت عندما نلقي القبض على هؤلاء الإرهابيين يحالون إلى القضاء لينالوا جزاءهم العادل.
With the focus now on intelligence gathering and accountability, let's turn to our guests. Tom Sanderson is the former Director of Transnational Threats at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also a geopolitical affairs consultant. And Daniel Gabriel is a former CIA counterterrorism officer. He has completed 6 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's also a filmmaker. His feature-length documentary Mosul is about Iraqis uniting to reclaim the city from ISIS. Dan Gabriel, you know Mosul and Iraq particularly well, but looking at your recent tweets, you seem skeptical that ISIS has indeed been defeated the way the US president claims.
Well, look, I think if we look at the caliphate as a regional or a political entity, I think it's safe to say that they no longer hold Mosul and they no longer hold Raqqa. But I think Tom would probably agree with me that it's really about an ideology, and that's really where we need to pay our attention going forward.
And so what about the remnants and the sleeper cells? When you were there on the ground, and this was many years ago, did you see anything to suggest that they are still deeply entrenched within the social fabric of that city?
Well, certainly. In the film we show, there's a scene where there's refugees that are crossing the river, and the question for the Iraqi security forces is to weed out who is really a refugee and who may actually be embedded still with ISIS and just trying to escape.
And can you ever do that, Tom Sanderson?
It's extremely difficult to do. You're relying on witness accounts from the battlefield. You also have to deal with people who are providing false testimony in order to get a rival in trouble. It is a very fluid environment, very difficult to weed out those who are truly responsible for actions inside of ISIS.
And you've been traveling to the border between Turkey and Iraq. You have met some of the ISIS fighters. How much disarray does the group seem to be in? The fact that they have lost their so-called caliphate, does that mean that they no longer pose the threat that they once did?
They do continue to pose a threat. However, it is critical and a great development that we were able to remove the territory which they controlled, which is about the size of Great Britain. Real estate is revenue, and they were able to generate a lot of funding to provide for the 45,000 foreign fighters that came to join them, that provided the social services, that gave them credibility in the ability to recruit worldwide. Taking that away was a critical step, but it is not the end of the story.
And in taking that away, Dan Gabriel, a lot of unlikely bedfellows came together to fight this common enemy, from Iran to Russia to the United States. And the liberation of Mosul and these other cities like Raqqa and Syria did not come at a very low price, did it? I mean, these are cities that were pounded for days by the most sophisticated air forces, more than 40,000 civilians apparently killed.
Right. I think from the outset, the conclusion was never in doubt in terms of there would be a military victory over this relatively small number of ISIS fighters, certainly given the large array of uneasy allies that were arrayed against them. I think the question has always been, and certainly this is really the central theme of Mosul, is what happens after the military victory, and do these groups go back to their old ways?
So what happens after this victory, Tom Sanderson? Has Donald Trump overstated the value of ending the so-called caliphate?
He has overstated it, but I think that the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and the broader counter-ISIS coalition around the world understands where we are in the battle against this group. It is ongoing, it is ideological in nature. There are many other steps that we need to take. The military is one element of it, and we have been effective in that. But the question at the end of the day is what fills the space that we've taken away from ISIS? What does fill the space in the former caliphate area? Is there economic development? Is there efforts to address sectarianism and all the other elements that make this still a viable recruiting ground for ISIS?
And how effective, Dan Gabriel, from your knowledge of ISIS and their recruits, how effective is their local knowledge combined with their technical know-how? Despite the declarations of victory, there are reports that suggest that they are actually ramping up their attacks in northern Syria, in Iraqi Kurdistan. Does that make Mosul particularly vulnerable?
In Sri Lanka, sure. What the next ISIS looks like, nobody knows. But there's no doubt they're evolving and that threat is emerging.
But so how do you stop that threat?
Well, it's a full spectrum of government and non-government efforts that incorporates development and aid, it incorporates military power and law enforcement, and certainly diplomacy.
But this is a heavily decentralized structure now that Tom Sanderson, ISIS operates under, and there's the other issue of the funding. According to a UN report published just last January, the group has anywhere between $50 to $300 million in cash hidden in Syria or Iraq or smuggled into neighboring countries.
Yes, and they can use that for recruitment, they can use it for operations, for encrypted phones, they can do it for use it for all manner of tools and opportunities they need to continue their fight. And this is spread out among many countries, and in some ways it's a little bit harder to counter them now because they don't have that center of gravity that the caliphate represented.
And what about this brand, this global brand that they have built, Dan Gabriel, which anyone around the world can tap into and exploit?
The key to countering it is, as Tom mentioned, partnerships, collaboration, and alliances.
But mostly with whom?
Well, I'll give you something that's probably not well known and certainly not popular in this town. But if you look at Mosul, you'll see the Iranian influence to assist in the liberation of Mosul from ISIS. And that's something that certainly as Americans don't necessarily understand that immediately. So, you know, whether the administration is able to look for ways that they can find common ground with the government of Iran to fight Islamic extremism, maybe that's a bridge too far. But what we do know is that it's been now 4 years since, or 5 years rather, since Operation Inherent Resolve. And that really is a measure of what we're talking about. It was the ability of the U.S. government and our partners, including the Iraqi security forces, to train and equip Iraqis to fight the battle against ISIS, and that's what the film shows.
And what about accountability? Because we know now that the Iraqis are actually conducting some of these trials to try some of the fighters who've been, or at least who are suspected of having carried out some of these atrocities during the Battle of Mosul. A UN report recently suggested, though, that Iraq find alternative routes such as the International Criminal Court. Where should accountability come from?
Well, let me flip that for a second. Another thing that we show in the film, again, is cell phone footage of some of the Iraqi forces committing essentially war crimes against, alleged ISIS fighters. So there is the question of accountability, judicial process, and how the Iraqi government will manage that. And they're going to need international cooperation.
And just a quick yes or no to you both. Do you believe this fight is over or far from it? Dan Gabriel?
No.
Much more to do.
Tom Sanderson and Dan Gabriel, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
So while the so-called ISIS caliphate has been vanquished, at least for now, its ideology will be harder to fully eradicate unless all state and non-state actors stop supporting such groups in their proxy wars. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next time.